Hello, everybody, and welcome to Weber State University's Zoom Career Bites. Zoom Career Bites is a webinar that we hold every Wednesday from 12 to 12:30, where we bring in a business executive to present a specific topic that will help us to sharpen the saw, help us to become better at our job search efforts. This presentation is for 30 minutes, and then immediately after that, we'll have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. The presentation that you're about to watch is by Tony Mund. This presentation, the very beginning of it, the first few seconds was clipped off, but you will catch the slides in the presentation of Tony. We apologize for the technical issues that are there. But we're excited to have Tony join us. Tony is an HR executive with 14 years of HR experience, leading HR with companies such as Orbital, ATK, and Autoleave. She received her bachelor's degree from Utah State University and then her MBA. Tony has been a great partner for Weber State University in her willingness and ability to help our students and alum to go find those right jobs and to understand where they fit and what is right for them. Tony also differentiates herself because she is a forward thinker. She's not just a block and tackle HR person, but she's always thinking ahead of the game about how people can best present themselves and how recruiters can best recruit. And this forward thinking is going to be demonstrated in her presentation on emotional intelligence. How can we use emotional intelligence to help us land a job? How to recognize the emotions within ourselves and within those that we interview with. How does that help us to give us our best pitch in that job process? And then how do people evaluate our emotional intelligence? How do they evaluate our behaviors, and what do we tell them, and what do we say in the interview to optimize their perception of us? And that all will be in Tony's presentation. So hope you enjoy it, and let me hand it over to Tony.
Gives us the ability to manage behavior and relationships so that we can see the results in our lives that we want to see. Emotional intelligence can be a bit intangible, but is something that each of us have or we don't have. It affects how we manage all of our interactions in the external world. So a couple of things I want to just talk about what I want to cover today. I'm going to introduce emotional intelligence just a little bit more. I'm going to talk about emotions in your brain. I want to talk about how our thoughts create emotion and that drive us to take action. I'm going to introduce a tool that is, the concept is self-coaching in the gap, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along in this presentation. And then I'm going to show you some practical application to that tool that I'm going to show you today. So just really quickly, this presentation that I'm showing you today typically takes me about 8 hours in a workshop to get through this material. So I'm going to be feeding you with a fire hose. So if you feel overwhelmed or if it feels like a lot, that's okay. I kind of expect that. I hope though, as you leave this presentation, what I tell you today and what I present to you today piques your interest enough that you'll go and search out a little bit more about this idea of emotional intelligence and how you need to become aware of it for your own success. So I want to talk about EQ and IQ. EQ refers to, or emotional quotient, refers to a measurement of someone's emotional intelligence. Right? It's the way that we discuss a person's level of emotional intelligence that is operating in their lives. We also know that certain groups have a level of emotional intelligence as well. We can measure emotional quotient in a group or an individual. The good news about emotional intelligence is actually something that you can develop. So unlike IQ, it's not static. It's something that's very dynamic. And as we are conscious of this idea of emotional intelligence, we can make a concerted effort to increase our emotional intelligence and improve our lives. Our emotional intelligence is tied to our subconscious mind, and I'm going to talk about emotional intelligence in the brain here in just a few minutes, but we really tie emotional intelligence to those things that are happening in our brain that are just below our conscious mind. It's tied to our beliefs and our emotions, our habitual patterns, the things that we value, our imagination, our intuition. All of those types of things are tied directly to our emotional quotient, or excuse me, our emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence, the idea of emotional intelligence isn't new. Emotional intelligence, you can read about it in all of the religious scripts. The Stoics talked about emotional intelligence, but emotional intelligence and emotional quotient really started to be introduced in the world of work or the world of business in the early 1990s. There's a lot of material that you can go out and research. There's great books. This Emotional Intelligence 2.0 book is a book that I use to coach people all of the time. I'll have them get the book. It has an assessment that measures your emotional intelligence and gives you really practical ways how you can develop your emotional intelligence. Harvard Business Review has an entire series on emotional intelligence and the importance of it. So the idea of emotional intelligence really was introduced again into the business world in the early 1990s. One of the things that we know from the research and the things that we've learned is that companies hire for high EQ. More and more we see that through the way that they interview. And so I'm going to talk about behavioral-based interviewing, and I'm going to tie the idea of emotional quotient and emotional intelligence to behavioral-based interviewing here in just a few minutes. We know, though, that people with a high EQ are high performers. They're very good on teams. They're very collaborative. We know that people with a high EQ have a higher earning potential. There's data that would back that up. And we know that people who have a high EQ are self-motivators. They look for ways to motivate themselves and find purpose and meaning in their work. So really, again, a lot of really great things that are tied to EQ, emotional intelligence, and important that we're aware of this and how this dynamic plays out in our lives. So I want to give you a very elementary introduction to our brain, emotional intelligence, and how our brain works. And again, I hope there's no brain surgeons on the line, because you will know very quickly that this is very elementary. Basically, the human brain has three different parts. We have our frontal lobe, we have our subconscious, or our back brain, the brain that's right there by our spinal stem, and then we also have the middle brain, which is the amygdala. It is widely agreed upon. There are some dissenting opinions, but the human brain is the only brain that has a really highly developed frontal lobe, and that is really our conscious brain. It's our brain that receives information and that thinks for us very consciously. Our lower brain, or this brain that's down here by our spinal cord, our spinal stem, is our it's often referred to as the lizard brain. It's where data is stored and all of our habits and emotions and our beliefs reside. Our subconscious brain, or our lizard brain, starts to become developed in our infancy. So our parents, our surroundings starts giving us information that we store in our lower brain. And we're all like that. It's just, that's the way the human brain is made up. And then this emotional center is how we process information and tie emotion to it. And at its very core, our brains are made up to perceive threats and danger and react very quickly and instinctively to danger. As we have evolved as humans, we have created a bigger capacity to be able to think through the external stimulus that's coming at us, and we have the opportunity to perceive it and then choose on purpose how we're going to respond to it. So as you think of most animals, they're very habitual in their patterns and how they react to external stimuli. Something comes into their brain, and their back brain emotionally responds to it without even having to process it. Humans have that front brain, and we're able to process and use it. Unfortunately, most of us aren't aware of this. We are very reactive in most of our interactions, and the way that the world presents to us And so we're responding to our world and our external environment with habits and patterns and beliefs that are given to us by individuals that typically raise us. Some of us are really fortunate where we have role models from infancy that are mirroring really highly emotionally intelligent responses to the world around us. And some of us have to work a little bit harder to develop that. So in a nutshell, it's really important for us to know that between emotional stimulus, so an external stimuli, we have the opportunity to immediately engage our emotional brain or our middle brain. That's usually what habitually happens. Or we have the opportunity to engage our thinking brain and decide on purpose how we're going to react to the external stimuli. Highly emotionally intelligent people utilize this gap. I'm going to call it the gap throughout the rest of the presentation. This opportunity to engage with our thinking brain and decide on purpose how we're going to respond to stimuli. So this is a little reiteration of what I just went over. It's just demonstrated a little bit differently. Most of you probably have heard of Stephen Covey, and we've got a model here that he's presented. Again, this isn't new. This is really just, you know, it's the wisdom in this model is as old as time. But again, we have external stimuli, something happens to us, and then we each have the opportunity to respond. We always respond to external stimuli. What we have the opportunity, or where our opportunity exists, is in that gap between the stimuli and the response. So this is really great news. When we discover this, you should get really excited about it, that we actually have a lot of power in what happens to us, because our responses typically dictate our results in our life. So the key here is the time between the stimuli and the response, and really managing and utilizing that gap, the gap between before we actually choose to respond. So our reactions are typically ruled by habit. It's automatic and lacks reflection. This is how most of us go about our day. We'll call it on autopilot. And then we also have this opportunity for a proactive response, where we're really making a concerted effort to choose wisely how we respond to our environment so that we can create the results that we want in our life. Highly emotionally intelligent people really reflect on this, and they really understand this process. So I'm going to introduce a tool that we're going to use later on in this presentation. It's the CTFAR tool that I have here. And again, it's a reiteration of the last two slides. We have a circumstance. Typically it's neutral until we prescribe a meaning to it through our thoughts. Our thoughts regarding any circumstances are often unintentional. They're very habitual unless we're making a decision on purpose how we're going to think about and perceive the world around us. Our thoughts generate feelings, our feelings generate actions. So it's this idea of we're either acted or acted upon, and then ultimately our results. So we're going to start looking at what results are showing up in our lives, and how can we back up into this model and really start getting clear on, you know, what are my thoughts? How am I perceiving the world around me? And is there some adjustments that I can make there so that I can see more of the results that I really want to see in my life? And I promise I'm going to tie this to behavioral-based interviewing as we go along. But again, I want to reiterate that what I'm teaching here applies to every aspect of your life. It's really exciting to start understanding this and seeing how we can utilize this information to make changes in our life. So it's important that we talk about the gap. The gap happens really quickly. Stimulus and response, the segment that we have where we really can choose on purpose our responses to our external stimuli is sometimes in a millisecond. And so we need to be very, very conscious of that. Through an awareness, we can practice what I'm going to call self-coaching. And I'm going to introduce a tool to you in a few minutes on how we can increase our emotional quotient. So it's by and through awareness and self-coaching that we can increase our emotional quotient. So as humans, and this is across the board, our brains are wired to be somewhat lazy. Our motivational trifecta here is that we, as humans, we seek pleasure, we avoid pain or painful emotion at all expense, and often we expend minimal effort. So if things are going generally pretty well and there's not a lot of disruption in our lives, we often don't go out and seek growth opportunities that are going to get us out of our comfort zone. But through awareness and self-coaching and a desire to increase our emotional intelligence, we can really flip this emotional, this motivational trifecta on its side. We can seek growth opportunity, we can embrace the discomfort that comes with that, and then expend massive effort wisely towards achieving the things that we want to in our life. So emotions going unchecked can decrease our EQ and contribute to undesirable results. So think about the results that you get when you spend a lot of time in feelings like irritation, confusion, overwhelm, apathy. I mean, this is just a few of the list of negative emotions that if we just run on autopilot and we don't understand what thoughts are generating these emotions, they can really reduce our emotional quotient and really stymie our growth and our opportunities. As we check our emotions by getting clear on our thoughts and our beliefs about our circumstances, we can choose on purpose how we want to think about things and move forward. So I'm going to talk about 3 of the components that reside in this idea of emotional intelligence. And I'm going to start tying it to, first of all, behavioral-based interviewing. So I'm going to show you some examples about how social skills and developed social skills will benefit you in your interviewing process. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the components of self-awareness and self-regulation. And I'm going to show you a tool and a model that you can use to increase your emotional quotient through these tools and self-coaching, and in turn, increase your emotional quotient. So the emotional component of social skills. All companies, whether doing it consciously or not, are interviewing for social skills. If you're graduating with a degree from Weber State University, it's already pretty much a given that you have some intellect, right? You've completed a bachelor's degree, which is no small feat, and you have some intellect. So that an interviewer can know that by looking at your resume. You know, you've graduated, you've got your GPA, and they have a pretty good sense of what skills that you have, technical skills you have because of the classes that you've taken to earn that degree. But one of the things that they do through a behavior-based interview is they try to understand what type of social skills you have. So the definition is that you are good at managing relationships. And when we think about relationships, we're talking about relationships with yourself, with other people, with customers. So other people meaning teams or customers. And then also your relationship with systems. Because as you go to work in corporate America or private businesses, you're always going to be dealing with difficult systems. They don't always do what we need them to do. So how skilled are you in managing and demonstrating skill in those areas? So some of the competencies that we often look for when we're interviewing is dealing with customers, managing through systems, being solution oriented, and time management. Those are just a few of the skills that we interview for. Self-awareness and self-regulation is really what I've already been talking about, is this idea of being very clear, self-aware of our emotions, our triggered reactions, and then being really good at self-regulating them so that we're creating actions and reactions to our external world to get the desired results that we want. So I'm gonna switch, and I know that's a lot of information, and now I'm gonna switch to demonstrating emotional intelligence in the interview. So again, a lot of information, and I know this is a lot, but I hope that it comes full circle for you and you're able to connect the dots here. So with emotional the emotional intelligence component of social skills. We know that by and through behavior-based interviewing, so this is the type and style of interview where you're sitting across the room from a hiring manager and they've maybe asked you a few questions on your technical skills. They're going to start at some point getting to some of these behavior-based questions, and they're going to present the question in a fashion that sounds like, tell me about a time when you had a difficult, or you perceived you were dealing with a difficult customer. How did you deal with that situation? What they really want and what they're really trying to get at is what type of behaviors do you go to deal with challenging people, systems, etc. And all hiring managers, I can tell you because I'm one of them, all hiring managers want to know that you have, or that you can demonstrate through your responses that you have a highly emotionally intelligent response to the challenges that are presented to you in the world of work. So I've given a bunch of cues here. I'm not going to go through all of them because it would be too much for this time frame that we have. But we're gonna, I'm just gonna touch on a couple of these here. So what if you're giving a response to a behavior-based question, your interview panel or the hiring manager is going to be looking for indicators that you are highly aware of. Let's say you're being asked a question about a time that you had a failure in a program or a project or a presentation that you were giving. Your response is going to indicate whether you take personal responsibility for the episode or the failure, or if you're going to place blame on others. Responses that indicate that you're willing to take personal responsibility rather than blaming others is going to indicate that you have a high level of emotional intelligence. All right. You may get a question in a behavioral-based interview on how you handle criticism. You know, tell me about a time during a performance review where your boss had to give you some a lower score on performance. So your response to that question, whether you acknowledge shortcomings and then how you mitigated that situation or whether you got defensive, is going to indicate whether or not you're emotionally intelligent and that you're skilled in this area. Again, I want to illustrate or reiterate how important it is that you go into your interview ready and prepared with responses that hopefully show that you have, that you can respond, you can show that you respond to these situations in an emotionally intelligent way. Certainly not with embellishing your responses, but hopefully you've got enough experiences that you're starting to recognize whether or not you're emotionally intelligent responding to your world of work adequately or not. And I'm going to talk in these next slides how you can build your emotional intelligence. So as you think about this, you're thinking, gosh, you know, I'm starting to recognize that maybe I have a lot of opportunity in this area to build my emotional intelligence. I'm going to give you a really deceptively simple tool on how you can develop in that area. So next up, I want to give you some examples of behavior-based questions. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to give you at least an idea of the types of questions you're going to get. I want to draw your attention to what the hiring manager, the hiring panel is really trying to understand by and through your responses is how well you handle criticism, how you resolve conflict, whether you listen to and involve others, and are you a motivator or a demotivator on a team. So these are just a few of the things that they're listening for in your responses. All right. So these are some examples of some behavior-based questions. If you've previously reported to multiple supervisors at the same time, how did you get to know each person's preferences and juggle conflicting priorities? This is a question that I ask quite often in an interview. What I'm trying to get at is, you know, how do you handle and manage what can be conflicting priorities from a matrix leadership team? How do you manage conflict? How do you manage and make sure that you're clear on expectations? Do you take personal responsibility to that, or do you cave under pressure? Another question is, tell me about a conflict in the workplace, when you were on a team and you maybe had some peers that you didn't agree with. How did you manage that? Was your default to get defensive and angry and not be willing to work with someone, or were you more willing to reach out to individuals and show that you wanted to extend yourself and work through and find solutions to work together as a team? So I'm going to transition to the other two emotional intelligent components that I presented just a few slides ago. That's self-awareness and self-regulation. I want to introduce to you a very powerful tool. It's a journaling tool that I think is one of the most powerful things that has ever been presented to me, and that I've utilized and been able to discover a lot of gaps that I've had in my own personal life and my work life, and I've been able to work through some things to generate some of the more desirable results that I was coming up short on in my life. So I want you to think about what emotions come up for you on a regular basis. What are some of the default emotions that you find just really triggering for you, your environment is triggering a lot for you? And then think about what thoughts create those emotions. Get really clear on what you're thinking when those emotions are coming up. Most of us are on autopilot. We don't even take the time to even consider that this is a thing. We think that the world is happening to us rather than our world is presenting to us, and then we're interpreting it and then making or creating a response to the world because of our beliefs, our habits, and we need to question that. So are your actions and results demonstrating a high emotional quotient? Are your results what you're wanting to see in your life? If they aren't, I want to challenge you to start taking responsibility for that. And we can really do that through this journaling exercise. You can sit down in the morning every day. What I do is I sit down before I do anything else in the day. It's called stream of conscious journaling, and you sit down and you take 15 minutes and you write for 3 pages or whatever you decide, whatever time frame, however much writing you want to do, but you just sit down and you write what's in your mind and you get it on paper. And then you start looking at your thoughts and you start plugging your thoughts into this model or this tool. You get really clear on what you're thinking. And then you start asking yourself, are these thoughts that I'm having generating the feelings and the actions and the results that I want in my life, specifically with the people that I'm working with or the people that reside in my home? Are they contributing to or demonstrating a high level of emotional intelligence? And if not, what types of thoughts and feelings will contribute or result in a demonstration of a higher emotional quotient? So I'm going to give you an example of how we can use this in relation to our behavior-based interviewing. So let's imagine you're in an interview and you're being asked this question. Tell me about a time you perceived a coworker as not contributing to the team. How did you handle it? This is a really common question. It might be presented differently, but this is a pretty common question. So if you were to really think about yourself and your emotional quotient and a time that you truly were working with a coworker that you perceived as not contributing to the team, what would your unintentional model look like? So the circumstances, you have a coworker. Your thought about this coworker, she isn't pulling her weight, and your automatic reaction, without even thinking, a habitual reaction or feeling, thought and feeling might be, she's not pulling her own weight and I'm irritated by her. So the action that might result from that is you talk to other coworkers about this individual to strive to get agreement on her low skill, and then you create conflict or a lack of cohesiveness on the team. This is a demonstration, a very clear demonstration of a low emotional quotient. And we see this all the time in our workplace. So on the flip side of that, an intentional model and how we can demonstrate a higher emotional quotient is Same circumstance, we have a coworker. Our thought might be, we notice that she's struggling to engage with the team. She's really having a challenge. And so a feeling that might result from that thought is, I'm curious as to why this is happening for her. The action that you would take is you'd go and talk directly to that coworker to understand what she needs. Is she lacking in skill? Is she not motivated? Is something happening that's demotivating her? Or is she not clear on expectations? And getting really clear by taking that action would really move us towards a better result, a more cohesive team. You'd be demonstrating a leadership capacity, more empathy. So those are the types of reactions that we would be looking for in a team member that would be demonstrating a high emotional quotient, and someone that I would be more likely to want to hire. So this is a lot of information. I'm already at 30 minutes, so I'm going to wrap things up. I hope that because you'll have access to this presentation, you'll be able to look at this tool. Again, it's very deceptively simple, but it's very, very powerful if you want to use it towards creating more emotional intelligence. So I'm going to just shift to this quote by one of my favorite authors. His name is Robert Greene. He's got a bunch of books out there that are about creating more emotional intelligence. And he says that true genius is a strategy. In strategy or anywhere lies in self-control, self-mastery, presence of mind, and fluidity of thought. So with that, any questions?
Tony, thank you very much for that. Any presentation that closes with a picture of Yoda is an awesome presentation there.
I agree.
Yeah, so Tony, let me, there's some questions come through. Let me serve them up to you.
Okay.
You talked about emotional intelligence in interviews. Is there any way to show emotional intelligence when I write my resume?
That's a really good question. Maybe in a cover letter. I think that there's some opportunity in presenting emotional intelligence by and through a cover letter. The resume is really reserved oftentimes for illustrating technical proficiency. However, when we talk on our resume about leading teams to success, it does imply that a successful leader is emotionally intelligent and leading teams in a proactive way, especially if we're seeing results and we're showing the metrics of those results. So maybe not hitting emotionally intelligence straight on an interview, or excuse me, on a resume, but some of those bulleted items that tie back to success, especially when we talk about working with systems and teams, does tie to emotional intelligence, yes.
Okay, great.
Again, on a cover letter or an objective statement, we might be able to really hit it more directly.
Second question, Tony. The question asked is if you could give a response example to a manager when you score low in performance. So I'm assuming this means that if they ask a behavioral question and you had performed poorly, how do you respond? How do you use that poor performance turn it into a positive answer?
That's a really good question. So I think that a response, okay, so if you're in an interview and you're asked if you were ever given a low performing score and how you responded to it, I think one of the first things that you can do is acknowledge that it was difficult to receive the feedback. One of the things that I don't want to suggest by and through this is that we as humans don't have negative emotions or negative things aren't presented to us. Having a response to being disappointed in feedback is very, it's very human and it's very natural, and it's actually something that we want to see, right? We don't ever want to be happy about getting a poor performance review. I think the follow-on to that after you acknowledged that it was very difficult, is what steps did you take to remedy the situation? So if I get a poor performance score, my leader says, you know, I'm really disappointed in the way that you presented that material to our leadership last week. It's very disappointing news. It might be a little bit embarrassing. You can acknowledge that in the interview, but then you want to talk about, these are the steps that I took so that I could build my skill in that area. I went and asked somebody who I feel like is a very good presenter, give me some coaching on presenting. So showing a proactive approach to getting the poor performing score. No, it's not just like, I got the poor performance score, I'm really mad about it, I disagreed with it, and I went and found another job because I didn't like that leader anyway.
Okay. Then the next question is that if I go into interview and I've worked through how I'm going to answer the questions, I've worked through giving examples of my performance, etc., but I'm nervous, I'm scared, is that going to reflect poorly on me, on what my EQ is? And how do I control that?
I want to say no. Now, I can tell you as an interviewer myself, I'm pretty empathetic. I think most interviewers, especially when we're entering the workforce and we're new entering into a corporate workforce, there's some expectation that we're going to be very nervous. Now, if you're applying for an executive position, the expectation's different, right? You've got many, many years of working in an industry with lots of experience, you're going to be less nervous. But if you're entering the workforce for the first time, or if you're entering a new profession for the first time, there's an expectation that you're going to be nervous. And it's okay to even state, I'm nervous. It might be, you know, I need you to restate that question, or I need a little bit of time to think about my response. That's okay to do that. It's okay to be nervous in an interview. It's natural. What we want to show is that we're prepared and we're thoughtful in our responses. We want to have in our back pocket a general narrative about ourselves, about our competencies and our skills and our experiences, so that we have a reservoir to pull from when we're trying to present our story to an interview panel or an interviewee. So again, it's okay to be nervous. It's expected. It's okay to even fumble a question and ask, may I try to answer that again? Let's say you start down a path and you're answering a question and you're thinking, this isn't what I really wanted to say at all, or this isn't coming out the way I wanted it to come out at all. It's really fine to stop and say, may I start over? Or I think I'd like to use a different example, okay? But again, you don't want to go into the interview fully unprepared. You want to have spent some time thinking through and have a reservoir and a really strong narrative about yourself and your skills that you can pull from.
Great.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you very much. This video of this presentation, it will be available early next week. And to see this presentation and presentations of past weeks, you can go to the Zoom Career Bytes webpage. And the simple way to find that is just Google Weber State Zoom Career Bytes. Click on it and it will show you the calendar, and it will show you future events and topics and dates. And for past presentations such as today, it'll have a copy of the recording that you can watch there and catch up on anything that you missed. Next week, we are going to have a presenter talk to us about LinkedIn. Kyle Pohl, he's the head of new business sales for LinkedIn. So hence a expert on this. He's also a Weber State alum. He's going to talk to us about how to use LinkedIn to find a job. You know, you've probably heard a lot of people tell you, get on LinkedIn, but why? And how do I use it? And is it more than just the electronic resume? And Kyle is going to be able to present to us on that. Tony, thank you very much for your time today. You get a lot of good information, and I think that the people that are viewing this today, if they go and look at your video next week and go back and look at your pages, look at the information there, look at your behavioral questions, that will help them to really understand it. And I'd also encourage you guys to go and Google emotional intelligence, EQ, and be able to see that, how that can help you and wrap your arms around it. It's not as complicated as I think most people view it, but understanding how you can present yourself and beyond just the standard answers in the interview will pay off. Tony, thank you very much. Everybody, thank you for joining.